Every shot fired tells a tale. Subscribe today and uncover the legends of the Wild West. The year was 1868, and the Kansas plains burned under the summer sun. A boy named Frank Eaton rode beside his father that morning, his small hands gripping the saddle horn, eyes wide at the world around him. A land that smelled of dust, gun oil, and danger. His father, a proud Union man, had made enemies during the war, men who wore gray and never forgot defeat. 6 of them rode into town that day. They didn't come for talk. They came for blood. Frank watched from behind the fence as his father stood tall, refusing to run. The argument was short. The sound that followed, 6 shots, loud as thunder, would haunt him for the rest of his life. When the smoke cleared, his father lay in the dust, eyes open, staring into the empty sky. No sheriff came. No lawman rode out. The killers were gone before sunset, free men riding east. That night, little Frank sat by the fire, his small body trembling but his eyes dry. Tears, he thought, were for people who still believed in justice. He no longer did. A family friend named Mose Beeman came by the next morning, a man with gray in his beard and wisdom in his voice. He handed Frank a small, heavy object wrapped in cloth. Inside was a revolver. Long barrel, 6 chambers, still smelling faintly of powder. Mose crouched beside him, voice low and steady. "Son," he said, "the world ain't fair out here. There's no law but the one you make yourself. If you want peace for your father's soul, you'll have to earn it. You'll have to take it." Frank looked down at the gun. It was heavy, too heavy for a boy his size, but he lifted it anyway. It felt right, like something that had been waiting for him. He asked in a whisper, "What if I miss?" Mose smiled sadly. "Then you keep firing until you don't." That night, Frank dug a shallow grave for his father. He laid a hand on the mound of earth and made a vow. He would find the 6 men, one by one, and when he did, there would be no jury, no judge, only him, his gun, and the ghosts that followed. Years passed. Frank grew, and so did his aim. At dawn, he practiced. At noon, he reloaded. At dusk, he shot again until his fingers bled and the hammer clicked dry. He learned to draw from his hip faster than thought, to aim by instinct, not sight. He could toss a silver dollar in the air and split it before it hit the ground. The townsfolk started whispering. "That Eaton boy, the one whose father got killed, he's still practicing, still waiting." They said it with pity. They should have said it with fear. One evening, as the sun sank red behind the hills, Mose came back. He was older now, slower, but his eyes still sharp. He watched Frank shoot. 6 bottles in 6 heartbeats, never missing once. "Damn, boy," Mose said, spitting tobacco. "You're faster than greased lightning." He grinned and clapped the young man on the shoulder. "Guess we can't call you Frankie anymore. You're Pistol Pete now." The name stuck like gunpowder to his skin. But under the surface, the fire hadn't dimmed. At night, Pete would stare at the old revolver, tracing the worn metal with his thumb. He had the skill now. All that was left was the list. 6 names, 6 graves waiting to be dug. He tracked the first lead to a town on the New Mexico border, a mining settlement called Dry Creek. The sheriff there didn't ask questions. He just said, "You're looking for ghosts, son. Ain't nothing left of the war but graves." Pete nodded. "That's all I'm looking for." Before he left, Mose met him one last time. He looked at Pete like a father would at a son marching to his death. "Frank," he said, "you sure this is the road you want?" Pete tightened his gun belt, eyes cold as the steel at his hip. "I made a promise, and I ain't done till the debt's paid." Mose sighed. "Then don't let the devil ride with you too long, boy. He's a hard one to shake off." Pete rode out under a blood-red sunset, the prairie wind howling in his ears. Behind him, the world of childhood was gone, buried beside the man who'd taught him honor. Ahead lay 6 men, 6 bullets, and a reckoning written in gun smoke. The boy who'd once believed in justice had grown into something else. Something colder. He didn't believe in right or wrong anymore, only in the sound a gun made when it spoke the truth. As the stars came out, he stopped at a ridge overlooking Dry Creek. The town below glimmered faintly. Oil lamps, a saloon, the echo of laughter. Somewhere in that light was the man who'd murdered his father. Pete checked his revolver. 6 bullets. Enough for now. He holstered the weapon, tipped his hat low, and whispered into the wind. "Pa, I'm coming." The night swallowed the words whole, carrying them across the plains like a ghost's whisper. In that moment, the legend of Pistol Pete was born. Not in triumph, not in glory, but in the quiet promise of a boy who'd seen too much blood to ever sleep easy again. At the edge of the ridge, lightning flashed across the horizon, turning the sky the color of gunmetal. Pete swung into the saddle. The horse stirred, uneasy, sensing the storm ahead. He looked once more toward the dark valley and muttered, "1 down, 5 to go." The wind picked up, whipping the dust into a spiral around him as he rode into the night, a shadow against the stars, chasing ghosts with a gun full of thunder. The wind never stopped blowing across the plains. It sang through the canyons like a restless ghost, whispering stories of vengeance and blood. By the time Frank Pistol Pete Eaton reached Fort Gibson, he was no longer a boy chasing shadows. He was a man with eyes like cold iron and a draw that could split lightning in half. The fort was a hard place, a huddle of timber and gun smoke where soldiers and scouts came to prove what they were made of. Pete came for something else, to test himself against the fastest guns alive. He wanted proof that he was ready to finish what he'd started. The Army didn't like outsiders much, but they liked the challenge even less. When Pete walked in, dusty and silent, the soldiers laughed. "You come to enlist or entertain, boy?" one called out. Pete didn't smile. "Neither," he said. "Just came to see who's fastest." The laughter died quick. Someone fetched a sergeant, a broad man with arms like fence posts and a reputation for shooting straight. He stepped out into the yard, revolver spinning on his finger. "You think you can beat a soldier, son?" Pete shrugged. "Only one way to know." The sergeant barked a laugh. "All right, cowboy, when I say draw." The air thickened. The crowd gathered. The sergeant's hand hovered near his gun, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, "Draw!" 2 shots rang out as one. Dust puffed from the ground between them. For a moment, no one moved. Then the sergeant looked down. The button from his chest pocket had vanished, a smoking hole where it used to be. Pete's bullet had taken it clean off. The yard erupted in shouts. The sergeant just stared, then broke into a slow grin. "Hell, son," he said, "you're faster than any man I've seen. You ought to be wearing a badge, not running from ghosts." But Pete wasn't smiling. He holstered his revolver and said quietly, "The law didn't do nothing when they killed my pa. I'll take care of my own justice." The sergeant nodded slowly. "Then God help whoever's on your list." Word spread fast, faster than a prairie fire in summer. The boy from Kansas, the one they called Pistol Pete, could outdraw any man from here to the Rio Grande. Scouts whispered his name in saloons. Soldiers watched him practice with awe, and old gunfighters rode miles just to see if the stories were true. They were. Pete could hit 6 targets before most men cleared their holsters. He could light a match with a bullet and split a coin tossed into the sun. But he never bragged, never gambled, never wasted lead. He practiced like a man running out of time. Every morning, he'd stand at the edge of camp, facing the rising sun, his revolver low at his hip. He'd draw, fire, reload, repeat. Over and over. The rhythm was like a heartbeat. Draw, fire, reload, again. Each shot brought him closer to the faces that haunted his sleep. 6 shadows waiting somewhere out there in the dust. One night, an old Cherokee scout sat by Pete's fire. He'd been watching him for days. "You're fast," the man said, chewing on his pipe. "Too fast for peace." Pete looked up. "Peace is for men who've buried their ghosts." The scout nodded, staring into the flames. "And what happens when you run out of men to kill?" Pete didn't answer. The fire cracked between them, spitting sparks into the night. Later, when the scout was gone, Pete took out his revolver, turning it in his hand. It was no longer a weapon. It was an extension of his will. Every scratch, every burn mark, told a story. He thought of his father's grave. He thought of the promise he'd made. He was closer now. He could feel it. A week later, word came from a trader passing through the fort. One of the men Pete had been hunting had been seen near the Cimarron River working as a cattle guard for a rancher with a taste for whiskey and trouble. Pete packed his gear before dawn. The sergeant met him at the gate. "You don't have to do this alone," the man said. "I do," Pete replied. "It started with me. It ends with me." He mounted his horse, the leather creaking, the revolver heavy on his thigh. As he rode away, the soldiers watched in silence. They'd seen many men go off chasing revenge. Few ever came back. The trail to Cimarron was rough. Dry riverbeds, thorn brush, and the occasional buzzard circling overhead. Pete rode for 3 days, stopping only to rest his horse and clean his gun. When he finally saw smoke rising from a lonely ranch house, he knew he'd found his mark. The man was older now, heavier, but Pete knew that face. He'd never forget it. One of the 6 who D stood laughing over his father's assy body. The outlaw was drinking on the porch, feet up, gun on the table beside him. Pete rode straight in, the dust swirling around his horse's hooves. The man squinted into the sun. "You lost, boy?" Pete slid off his horse, eyes never leaving him. "Been lost for a long time," he said, "but I just found what I was looking for." The man frowned, reaching for his gun. Too slow. Pete's revolver cleared leather in a blur of motion. One shot. Clean. The man fell back in his chair, whiskey bottle shattering beside him. The echo rolled across the plains like thunder. Pete stood over him for a long moment, watching the life drain from his eyes. Then he tipped his hat and whispered, "That's one." He left the body where it lay and rode into the setting sun, the sky bleeding red behind him. Somewhere out there, 5 men still breathed. For now. As darkness settled over the land, Pete stopped at the edge of a canyon, listening to the wind hum through the rocks. He holstered his revolver and stared out into the emptiness. The fire inside him burned steady, but something new stirred beneath it. A shadow, a question. How many men would he have to kill before he stopped seeing his father as face in every dying eye? He pushed the thought away and turned his horse north. The stars above him glittered cold and silent, and the wind carried his whisper into the night. 5 to go. The wind had a sound that only men like Pete could hear, a low, steady whisper that carried both memory and warning. Weeks had passed since Cimarron, and though one name was crossed off the list, his heart felt heavier, not lighter. Each man he killed brought him closer to his promise, but farther from the peace he thought it would bring. Word of the duel traveled fast. They said a stranger with eyes like steel and hands quicker than death had ridden through Cimarron and left a man dead before he could blink. The story grew with every retelling, like wildfire spreading across the frontier. They called him Pistol Pete, the man who could outdraw the devil himself. Pete hated the name, but it stuck to him like dust on his boots. He tried to keep moving, staying one town ahead of his reputation. But legends have a way of catching up. When he rode into Dodge City, he could feel the stares before he even hit the saloon doors. Men turned to watch him pass, whispers floating through the smoke. Some were in awe, others in fear, a few in greed, the kind that sees fame as an invitation to test their luck. The piano went quiet when he walked in. Pete ordered a whiskey, kept to the corner, but trouble found him just the same. A young gun, barely 20 with a clean hat and a dirty smile, swaggered up to him. "You the one they call Pistol Pete?" Pete didn't look up. "Depends who's asking," the boy laughed. I heard you was fast. Figured maybe I'd find out for myself. Pete sipped his drink, slow and calm. You don't want that, son. The boy spat. I ain't your son. His hand twitched near his holster. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The air thick, the floorboards creaking beneath their boots. Then there was a flash, a crack, and the boy's gun fell before his body did. Pete's revolver was already back in its holster. You should have stayed home, he said quietly, and walked out into the dusty street. By the next sunrise, the story had already changed. Some said the boy never drew at all. Others swore Pete shot him in mid-blink. Either way, the legend grew, and so did the price on his head. Pete didn't care about fame, but fame cared about him. It followed him like a shadow, even to Fort Smith, where he ran into a lawman named Bass Reeves, one of the few men Pete respected. Reeves found him sitting outside a trading post, cleaning his gun. You're making a hell of a lot of noise for a man who says he is after peace, Reeves said, voice deep as a church bell. Pete didn't look up. I'm not after peace. I'm after justice. Reeves studied him for a long moment. There's a fine line between the two. Cross it, and you'll start looking like the men you're hunting. Pete didn't answer. He'd already crossed that line long ago. Reeves sighed and tipped his hat. You're a good shot, Eaton. Maybe the best I've seen. But sooner or later, you'll have to live with what that gun makes you. As Reeves rode away, Pete felt something stir inside. Doubt, maybe. Or fear. Not of dying, but of becoming what he despised. Still, he had 5 men to kill, and conscience could wait. By the time the winter came, Pete tracked the second man, a rustler named Burke, to a mining camp in the Wichita Mountains. Snow covered the earth like ashes, and every sound echoed in the cold. Pete waited till night, watching the campfire flicker through the trees. He moved like a ghost, quiet and sure, his revolver low and ready. When Burke stepped out to relieve himself, Pete was there. You remember Daniel Eaton? He said. The man froze, eyes wide. Jesus Christ, he whispered. Pete shook his head. He ain't here. The duel was short, too short. Burke's gun never cleared the holster. The snow muffled the sound, but Pete heard it clear. Another promise kept. As he stood over the body, he felt the same emptiness as before. No glory, no satisfaction, just cold wind and a name erased. He buried Burke under a mesquite tree and rode out by dawn. But that night, when he camped beneath the stars, he dreamed of his father again. Only this time, his father wasn't smiling. How many more, Frank? The old man asked. Pete woke up with his revolver in his hand and sweat running cold down his neck. He tried to tell himself it was just a dream. But deep down, he knew it was something more. A warning. The following months turned Pete into something less than a man, more than a myth. Every outlaw, every killer, every bounty hunter in the territories wanted a piece of him. Some for fame, others for revenge. He met them all the same way. Calm eyes, steady hands, one clean shot. They started calling him the gentleman gunfighter, because he always gave his enemies a chance to draw. Fair fight, he'd say, even if it ends the same way. There was one duel that defined his legend. Outside of Guthrie, 2 gunslingers, brothers, twins they said, came looking for him. They called him out in the middle of town, noon sun, high and merciless. The streets emptied, shutters closed, dogs hid under porches. Pete stepped out of the saloon, brushing dust from his coat. 2 of you? He asked. Seems unfair. The older twin grinned. You can have the first shot. Pete's eyes narrowed. That's your mistake. The clock struck 12. 2 flashes. 2 bodies hit the dirt. Pete holstered his gun without a word. A child peeked from a window, eyes wide, and whispered, That's him. That's Pistol Pete. The name stuck harder than ever after that. From Texas to Montana, from saloon to fort, people spoke of the man who never missed, who killed without hate but without mercy. To some, he was justice. To others, a ghost of vengeance that refused to die. But even legends bleed. On the trail north of the Canadian River, Pete took a bullet to the shoulder from a bounty hunter who got too close. He managed to kill the man, but the wound festered. Fever dreams haunted him for days. In one of them, his father stood over him again. "You can't shoot your way out of the past, son," the ghost said. "The past don't die. It waits." When Pete woke, the fever had broken, but his resolve had hardened. He swore to finish what he started, no matter how many ghosts it made. He cleaned his gun, mounted his horse, and rode west into the dying light. The wind followed him, whispering his name. Pistol Pete, the man who drew faster than his shadow, the man who killed for justice, and maybe, just maybe, for something darker. Somewhere out there, the next name on his list waited, and the legend of Frank Eaton was only beginning to take shape. The rain came down hard on the plains that night, a rare, angry storm that turned the dust to mud and the moonlight to shadows. Frank Pistol Pete. Eaton rode through it without slowing, his poncho heavy, his hat dripping. Each drop hit his coat like a drumbeat, steady, relentless, like the ticking of time running out. He'd heard a rumor 2 days earlier. One of the men on his list, Eli Parker, had been spotted near the Red River, running whiskey and guns for a band of cutthroats who called themselves the Black Spurs. Parker wasn't just another killer. He was the one who'd fired the first shot the night Pete's father died. If the others were ghosts in Pete's nightmares, Parker was the face that never faded. When Pete reached the river, the storm had broken into a cold mist. He tied up his horse and scouted the camp ahead, a cluster of wagons, firelight flickering through the rain. There were 6 men, maybe 7, drinking and laughing, their rifles leaning against the wheels. Parker was there, older now, his beard streaked gray, but that same cruel grin stretched across his face as he told some joke about a boy crying over his dead daddy. Pete's jaw clenched. He waited until Parker turned away, then stepped into the light. The laughter stopped. Every man reached for his gun, but Pete's was already up, steady, level. "Evening, boys," he said. "Which one of you goes by Parker?" Parker squinted through the drizzle, eyes narrowing. "Well, I'll be damned. Little Frank Eaton. I figured you'd be bones in the ground by now." Pete's voice was quiet, deadly. "You figured wrong." The campfire hissed as the rain hit it. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of dying flames. Then Parker smirked. "You come all this way to die, son?" Pete stepped closer. "No. I came to finish something." Parker's hand twitched toward his belt. Too slow. Pete fired once, the shot echoing like thunder. Parker staggered back, clutching his chest, eyes wide in disbelief. But before Pete could draw breath, the rest of the camp came alive. Gunfire exploded in the rain. Pete dove for cover, mud splashing as bullets whined past his head. He fired twice, 3 times, dropping shadows in the firelight. The smell of gunpowder mixed with wet earth and blood. When it was over, only the storm remained. Parker lay in the mud, gasping. Pete walked to him, holster empty, revolver smoking. "You killed my father," he said. Parker tried to speak, blood bubbling at his lips. "He had it comin'," he wheezed. Pete stared for a moment, then raised his gun again. "So do you." One final shot. Silence. The rain washed the blood into the dirt, erasing it as if it had never happened. Pete holstered his revolver and stood there for a long time, staring at the lifeless man. He thought he'd feel something. Satisfaction, release, peace. But there was nothing. Just the hollow echo of thunder rolling over the plains. He rode away before dawn, leaving the camp behind, but the emptiness followed him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Parker's face, not defiant, not afraid, just tired, like a man who'd been waiting for death too long. Pete didn't know if it was guilt or fate, but for the first time, he wondered if the men he hunted were just mirrors, reflections of what he might become. 2 days later, he stopped at a small frontier town called Doan's Crossing. looking for supplies and maybe a bed that didn't move with the wind. The townsfolk recognized him right away. A boy whispered, "That's him. Pistol Pete." An old woman crossed herself as he passed. Even the bartender served him with shaking hands. Pete didn't blame them. A man who carried death in his shadow never stayed welcome for long. That night, as he sat by the saloon window, lightning flashed across the horizon, and for an instant he saw a figure watching him from the rain. Tall, lean, black hat, hand resting on a gun. When Pete stepped outside, the street was empty, but he knew that feeling. Being hunted. It didn't take long to learn the name. Clay Boone. A bounty hunter out of Kansas, fast, mean, and paid by men who wanted Pete dead or alive. Mostly dead. For days, Boone tracked him across the plains, a game of hunter and hunted where both men knew how it might end. In the quiet hours, Pete could almost feel Boone's breath on the wind. At night, he'd hear hoofbeats that weren't there. He didn't sleep much. By the time they finally met, it was in a ghost town half buried by sand, the kind of place where even the echoes had died. Boone was already waiting when Pete rode in. He stood in the middle of the street, coat flapping, eyes sharp and clear. "Eaton," he called, "you've made a hell of a mess out here." Pete dismounted slowly. "Ain't you made your share?" Boone smiled thinly. "Difference is, I get paid for mine." Pete nodded. "Then you best earn it." The duel that followed would be talked about for years. Noonlight, no crowd, just two men and the ghosts of the West watching. Boone's hand hovered, twitching. Pete's fingers rested loose, relaxed. A tumbleweed rolled between them, and as it passed, both men drew. 2 shots cracked. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Boone's hat fell first, followed by the man himself. 1 shot through the heart. Clean. Pete stood there, breathing hard, the smoke curling from his barrel. Boone's body lay still. In the silence that followed, Pete looked down and whispered, "You should have stayed out of this, friend." He holstered his gun and walked away, but the echo of that duel followed him for the rest of his life. By the time he reached the next town, the story had already beaten him there. They said Pistol Pete had faced the deadliest bounty hunter alive and walked away untouched. They said he was protected by the ghosts of every man he'd ever killed. They said he couldn't die. Pete hated those stories. They made him sound like a hero when all he felt was hollow. That night, as he cleaned his revolver by firelight, he thought about Bass Reeves' S words. There is a fine line between justice and vengeance. He looked at his reflection in the polished barrel. Hard eyes, tired face, streaks of gray starting to creep through his hair. The boy who'd sworn vengeance was gone. What remained was something else, something colder. The wind outside shifted, carrying the scent of rain again. Pete looked up at the horizon and muttered, "3 down." He holstered his gun, fed another log to the fire, and leaned back against the wall. Somewhere out there, the last men on his list were waiting. But so was something else. The reckoning every gunfighter faces when the smoke finally clears. Rode Guthrie was still bleeding when the smoke cleared, his revolver lying half buried in the red Oklahoma dust. Frank "Pistol Pete." Eaton stood over him, Colt still warm in his grip. The man who had helped murder his father now lay still, eyes staring blankly toward the sky. For a long moment, Eaton didn't move. The revenge that had burned inside him for 20 years had finally been quenched, yet it didn't taste like justice. It tasted like ash. He holstered his gun, mounted his horse, and rode off into the setting sun, unaware that his legend was only beginning. Word of the shootout spread fast. The papers called him the fastest gun in the Indian Territory, the man who brought his own law to the frontier. But fame was a double-edged Colt. Wherever Pistol Pete went, challengers followed, men who wanted to test their luck against the legend. He didn't ask for it, but the world of the dying West had a way of making men into myths. The saloons of Guthrie buzzed with talk of him. They said he could draw and fire in less than a quarter of a second. Some said they'd seen him shoot the flame off a candle at 30 feet. Others swore he could split a playing card edgewise with one bullet. But to Eaton, those were just stories. He never cared for glory, only for the code he lived by. Protect the innocent. Punish the wicked. Stand your ground. One cold night, a posse rode into town, bringing word of a ruthless gang terrorizing settlers along the Cimarron River. Eaton didn't hesitate. He strapped on his twin revolvers, loaded each chamber with practiced precision, and joined the chase. They tracked the outlaws through the canyons, across the dry riverbeds until the moon rose silver over the plains. Then the ambush came. 6 rifles flashing in the dark. Bullets tore through the night, horses screamed, and the air filled with gun smoke. Eaton moved like a shadow, firing, reloading, moving again. One outlaw fell, then another. He dove behind a rock, the acrid smell of powder burning his lungs, his heart pounding with that same rhythm he'd known since he was a boy staring at his father as on killers. When the shooting stopped, the silence was deafening. 4 men lay dead. The others ran. Eaton, bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, looked up at the stars and realized he'd crossed another invisible line. He wasn't just hunting evil anymore. He was becoming something larger than any one man, a symbol of the Old West as justice, raw and untamed. The next morning, the marshal shook his hand. "Pete, you ride faster than the devil and shoot straighter than a prayer. You ever think about wearing a badge?" Eaton just smiled. "I don't need one," he said quietly. "My law's in here." He tapped his chest and rode off. Years rolled on. Railroads cut through the plains, telegraph wires strung across the land. The world was changing, and the frontier that had shaped him was fading away. But wherever the land still smelled of gunpowder and dust, Pistol Pete's name was whispered with a mix of fear and respect. In a small town outside Stillwater, a young boy once asked him if all the stories were true. Eaton looked down at the child, his face weathered by wind and time. "Some of them," he said with a grin. "The rest just make me sound prettier." He didn't tell the boy about the sleepless nights, or the faces that haunted his dreams. He didn't speak of the men he'd buried, or how the sound of a hammer cocking still made his stomach tighten. Some truths were too heavy to pass on, but he did tell him this. "Son, a man's aim ain't in his hand, it's in his heart." That boy would later grow up to help immortalize him, turning the real Frank Eaton into something greater than flesh and blood. The Oklahoma A&M College would take his likeness, his legend, and craft from it a symbol of courage, grit, and unbreakable spirit. And so the gunslinger who once lived by his own code became a mascot of American pride. Pistol Pete, the outlaw turned icon. A man who avenged his father, outdrew every gunman who challenged him, and lived long enough to see himself turned into a piece of living history. As he grew old, Eaton still wore his pistols on his belt, his back straight, his eyes sharp. When asked if he ever regretted his life, he'd chuckle. "Regret?" he'd say. "Hell, son, regrets for those who missed their shot." And when he finally passed at the age of 97, they said he went out like he lived, quietly, proudly, with his boots on. But the echo of his guns, the thunder of his name, still rides the wind across the Oklahoma plains. Because in the heart of every man who's ever stood up against the odds, there's a little bit of Pistol Pete still standing there, unafraid, unbroken, and aiming true. Years had rolled over the land like dust storms sweeping across the prairie. The frontier was gone. Railroads cut through the plains where wild buffalo once thundered, and the cries of cowboys were now echoes swallowed by time. Yet one name, one legend, refused to fade. Frank Pistol Pete Eaton. The gunslinger who once brought justice to lawless lands had outlived nearly every outlaw, marshal, and drifter of his age. His hands, once quick as lightning, had grown weathered, but his grip never trembled. Even in old age, his eyes burned with that same frontier fire, the look of a man who had stared death down too many times to ever flinch again. He spent his later years in Stillwater, Oklahoma, where folks came from miles around just to meet him. To them, he wasn't just an old man, he was living history, the last tie to a world that was vanishing. Children would sit at his feet, wide-eyed, as he spun tales of shootouts and dusty trails, of men who drew fast and died faster. But Pete never glorified the killing. He told them about courage, about loyalty, about living by a code when the world had none. He'd pat his revolver with a smile and say, "This ain't what made me strong, son. What made me strong was knowing when not to use it." As he aged, the newspapers still came knocking, eager to write about the last real gunslinger of the Old West. One reporter asked him if he ever felt guilty for the blood on his hands. Pete looked out the window, watching the Oklahoma sunset stain the sky in crimson and gold. "Guilt?" he murmured. "I never shot a man who didn't have it comin'. I just helped the Lord balance his books." When Oklahoma A&M College approached him to become the inspiration for their new mascot, Pete laughed so hard he nearly fell out of his chair. But when they explained that it was to honor his spirit, his courage, his frontier heart, he nodded. "If my face can remind folks to stand tall and fight fair," he said, "then I reckon that's worth more than any gunfight I ever won." They molded his image, the rugged jaw, the wide mustache, the eyes that carried both warmth and warning, and Pistol Pete was reborn. No longer just a gunslinger, he became a symbol of the American spirit, proud, fearless, and unbroken. Every time that mascot rides onto a football field, tipping his hat beneath the roar of a crowd, it's not just a costume. It's a ghost of the frontier, a living tribute to the man who refused to bow to chaos, who lived by his own law when no other existed. But legends, no matter how strong, must one day return to dust. When Frank Eaton finally passed in 1958, he was 97 years old. He died as he had lived, quietly with his boots on and his pistols close. At his funeral, the sky was clear and wide, like the open plains he once called home. Cowboys, soldiers, ranchers, and students came to pay their respects. As they lowered his casket into the ground, a single rider fired a shot into the air, one final salute to a man who had fired so many in the name of justice. The echo lingered across the fields, rolling like thunder. Some said they could almost see him there, riding off toward the horizon, his shadow long and proud against the dying light. And in that moment, Frank "Pistol Pete" Eaton wasn't just a man anymore. He was a promise that courage, honor, and grit would never truly die. Today, his pistols rest in a glass case, his hat faded with age. But his story still gallops across the American heart. Every time someone stands their ground, speaks truth when it's dangerous, or fights for what's right when no one else will, Pistol Pete lives again. He's in every whisper of wind over the plains, in every thunderclap that shakes the red dirt of Oklahoma. Because Frank Eaton was never about violence. He was about valor, about the unbreakable belief that a single man with a steady hand and a clean heart could make a difference in a world gone mad. And maybe that's why his story still matters. The world's gotten faster, louder, meaner, but deep down, we still look for men like him. Men who stand tall, live honest, and draw only when they must. So, if you ever find yourself cornered by the world, by doubt, by fear, by injustice, remember the old gunslinger who made his own law. Remember the man who rode through fire and never blinked. Remember Pistol Pete. He didn't wait for someone else to fix what was broken. He became the storm that cleansed the land. If you believe the spirit of the Wild West still rides in our veins, hit that subscribe button, saddle up, and join us. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We keep the legends alive